south and says, take control of the Jordan River. It would seem that it was very easy to cross the Jordan back and forth, right? That's how Abraham came to Israel. That's how Jacob went to Laban's house. Take control of the Jordan. So, and I assume it means catch any Midiani trying to get out and don't let any Midiani come in. Seal the border. And the tribe of Ephraim does that, but you could either say it goes above and beyond, or you could say it defies orders. Because the tribe of Ephraim does take control of the river, but it also crosses the river, chasing after the generals of Midian, who had led the fight against Bnei Israel. Their names were Zev and Orev, and they kill Zev and Orev, and they're bringing their heads, it's a little gross, back to Gidon. Gidon is on his way to cross the river and go into Midian and do the final defeat. And it almost seems as if Ephraim jumped the gun, took away Gidon's right. So in a minute, we'll talk about how Gidon handles receiving the heads of Zev and Orev. But before we go to that, something about geography. The only tribe, according to the original plan, to live, the only tribes, you're right, the only tribe to live on both sides of the Jordan River is the tribe of Manasseh. Originally, all of Bnei Israel would live west of the Jordan. And then, as you know, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh get permission from Moshe Rabbeinu to live on the east bank. We always talk about the west bank, but in Sefer Shoftim, there's no question that Israel goes up to the Jordan River. But then there are the 2.5 tribes on the other side. And the only tribe that's on both sides is Manasseh, which is, of course, Gidon's tribe. No Shofet so far has crossed the river. All the other Shoftim have considered getting the enemy over the river is getting them out of Israel. Because in many, many Tanakh stories, you see there's a struggle about whether those tribes across the river are really Eretz Yisrael or not really Eretz Yisrael. For Gidon, it's no question. The tribes b'Mizrach HaYarden are Israel, and if he's going to defeat Midian, he has to push them out of Israel on the eastern bank, and that's why he's pursuing them. The interesting thing is that Shevet Ephraim seems to see it the same way. In the map, as we usually print it, Ephraim is only on the west side. But in a Herzog lecture today that Nomi and I went to, one of the things that Rav Meidan said is that at this time in history, it seems that Ephraim is an unwelcome resident on the eastern side of the river. That Ephraim, and he gave all sorts of proofs, Ephraim has moved on to some of Manasseh's territory, and Ephraim is feeling entitled, and Manasseh is feeling resentful. Apparently, Manasseh agrees to their residence there, but doesn't want Ephraim to say it's their land. It's an extension of their tribe. They're willing to have them as guest residents. And so that adds another layer to his being late in calling Ephraim, telling Ephraim, hold the river, and Ephraim crosses the river. And Ephraim gets Zev and Orev. Why Zev and Orev? Exactly like getting Sisera in the Devorah story. The king isn't in the battle. The generals are in the battle, and now Zev and Orev are dead. And I'll share with you when Ephraim brings the heads of Zev and Orev to to Gidon and how he responds, which I think is really interesting. So here we are in the first psukim. These are the instructions that were given to Ephraim, right? And they brings the head, and then this is what happens. By Yomru Elav Ish Ephraim, and the men of Ephraim say to Gidon, Ma davar hazeh asita lanu levilti korot lanu, ki halachta lilachem b'Midyan. What is this? You choose some tribes to call them to war against Midian, and you don't call us? We're an important tribe, right? The tribe of Yoshua. We're your brother tribe, another tribe of Yosef. And also we reside on the other side of the river, if Rav Meidan is right. And the underlined part, Vayirivun ito b'chozka. And they argued ferociously with him. They were very angry. Vayomer alehem, in the highlighted part, Ma asiti ata kachem. Now what have I done to equal what you've done? Halo tov ololot Ephraim mibetzir Aviezer. Aren't the last grapes which Ephraim has picked better than the first grapes that Manasseh has picked? Right? In other words, I got there first, but you got the best. What are you complaining about? B'yedchem natan Elokim et sarei Midyan et Orev et Zev. God gave Zev and Orev into your hands, so you must be the select ones. Umay yacholti asot kachem. And what could I possibly do to equal your feat? So we now know that our uncertain, timid Gidon not only is a great warrior, he's quite a diplomat. He diffuses it immediately. He doesn't go to all the issues that I mentioned. He doesn't say, I didn't tell you you could go over. And what if it hadn't been worked out and you had been trapped behind enemy lines? He just says, you must be so proud of yourselves. You're greater than I am. And he ends with, Ma yacholti asot kachem. What could I do to equal your feat? Of course, what he can do and what he will do is to actually get the kings. But that's not what, he's not saying that now. And in the second underlined passage, Afrafta rucham me'alav b'dabro hadavar hazeh. And because he spoke in that way, he soothed them and they were no longer angry with him. And now he crosses the river with only 300 men, because what he's going to do now, he sees as part B of the battle where he could only have 300 men. And he's going after the kings. The kings who are so remote, they don't risk themselves in battle. Devorah had no notion that the people would not only take Sisera, but also go after Yavin, who was safe at home. But Gidon is going after the kings. The kings aren't well protected. Of their original, I think it's 120,000 soldiers, they have 15 left with them. But he goes with his 300 men. Oh, I skipped something important. I'm going to stop sharing for a second. I'm out of order. Excuse me. On his way to get the kings, which you know he will successfully do if you read the page, he has 300 exhausted men with him. And he goes to the city of Sukkot, well, the town, and says, we're on our way to get Zevach and Salmuna, the kings of Midian. Just give us some bread. And they say, do you have Zevach and Salmuna in your hands? Then we're not giving you bread. Because they're afraid if Gidon is going to lose, Zevach and Salmuna will take revenge on anyone who helped Gidon. But that means these are Jews refusing bread for the Jewish army. And Gidon is enraged, and he says, once I've got Zevach and Salmona, I'll come back and whip you with these thorns and thistles here in the field. And he goes to the next town called Penuel, and he says, we're exhausted, give us bread. And they also refuse for the same reason. And he says, when I come back, having gotten Zevach and Salmona, I'm going to knock down that tower which you rely on for protection. If you are prepared to rely on a tower rather than the army of Israel, when I come back, I'll knock the tower down. And we're not told if they get bread elsewhere or they fight hungry, but they do get Zevach and Salmona. And Gidon keeps his word in a very ferocious way. He was, what's the word? Lafayette. He tried to soothe and calm Ephraim, but Ephraim was willing to fight. He has tremendous respect for courage and volunteering, but these cowards, he comes back to Sukkot, and he and his men nab a young man from Sukkot outside the city. And they say, write down the names of the leaders of the city, because it's the leaders that refuse the food. And the young man writes down 77 names, which, by the way, is a sign that many Jews were probably literate in those days. And they take the list and they go and they whip those 77 leaders of Sukkot. And then they go to Penuel, and he said he'd knock down the tower, and he does. But it also says he killed people, or maybe the people, in Penuel as well. And there are many comments that say they tried to defend their tower and he killed them. But he was totally unsympathetic to their fear, right? But he had been in a battle so recently where the 22,000 fearful men were sent home. He himself was paralyzed with anxiety before the battle and needed so many signs to encourage him. This is a surprising turn of events, right? This is not Moshe-like. But the truth is, playing the diplomacy game with Ephraim is also not Moshe-like. Neither one of those are the words of, a holy man who just goes by the ultimate truth. Both are actions of a leader who thinks he knows what has to be done in the real world, who's very concerned with the message he sends. So the message he wants to send is fight for me and I'm with you, and don't support me and I'm against you, period. Not much gray in that. And after this great, now we'll go back to sharing, after this great victory against Zevach and Salmona, the political capital that Gidon has just can't be imagined. And once, the people are so admiring of him, and he brings out the kings and he explains to them that they killed his brothers. The kings acknowledge it. They say, yes, they look just like you. But the interesting thing is that this is not yet on the page. They say, they look just like the king, meaning you, Gidon. He's already being seen as a king. And Gidon says, had you not killed my brothers, I would let you live. To me, that seems very doubtful. The enemy king is always killed if you can get him. But that's what he says. And then he asks his son Yeter, his oldest son, who's still in Na'ar, to take a sword and kill the two kings. He seems to be signaling that they should not be put to death in a political assassination as the kings, of Midian to be defeated by the leader of Israel, but that it should be a family revenge killing. And so it's appropriate for his son to kill the men who killed his uncles. But the son loses his nerve. I guess you're noticing that fear and courage are a major theme in the story. And in the end, that men say a strange thing about Ka'ish Kigvurato, and it's not clear if they're saying the kid isn't strong enough, you do it, or if they're saying we're kings and we should be killed by a king, which is how they see Gidon, and Gidon kills them both. And that's where we take up the story on the page here. Perek Chet Pasuk Kafet. Vayakom Gidon vayarog et Zevach vet Salmuna. And then I put this in gray because to me it is so disappointing. Vayikach et hasaharonim asher b'tzavareg malehem. And he takes a souvenir. The Saharonim seem to have been some sort of crescent-shaped decoration on some sort of a chain or a strap with which they embellish their camels. And it's something of value, right? And he takes the king's Saharonim and I picture, he's holding them still in his hand. You can't conceive of Moshe, right? Taking trophies of war. And now we go to Kafbet. Vayomru ish Yisrael el Gidon. Mishol banu. Rule over us. Gam ata, gam bincha, gam ben bincha. Ben benecha. Your son and your grandson. Ki hoshatanu miyad Midian. Because you've saved us from Midian. In other words, we see that Midian sees you as our king. That's good. Be our king. We will make you the first king of Israel and the first of your dynasty. Vayomer Alehem Gidon, in the yellow, the voice of his men is the green and Gidon's voice is the yellow. Lo emshol ani bachem, I won't rule over you. V'lo yimshol b'ni bachem, nor will my son rule over you. Hashem yimshol bachem, God will rule over you. And if you think of the author as Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel is cheering Gidon on. That, in Shmuel's opinion, is the right answer. The only ruler we need is God. But Shmuel is so honorable, he tells us the rest of the story and leaves us in doubt whether Gidon did the right thing to decline the kingship. And in Kaf Daled, I don't know what he's acting like. He's acting a bit like Sisera, to tell you the truth. He just said, Rak Hashem yimshol bachem, and then look what's happening in Pasuk Kaf Daled. Vayomer Alehem Gidon, Hashalem mikem she'ela. I'm going to ask you for something. Could you give me all the gold earrings that you took off the Midianim? And the narration tells us, since Midian is a descendant of Yishmael, and Yishmaeli men wore earrings, there were a lot of earrings that they took off the bodies of the dead. And they spread out a cloth, and all the men said, Naton nitain, they all are happy to give him from their spoils. And a cloth is spread, and it's exactly weighed out. It equals 1,700 shekel kesef. Do you remember how Sisera's mother comforted herself when her son was late from the battle? And she said, oh, they're tallying up the spoils of war. They're divvying it out. And that is what Gidon is doing. We have no statement that there weren't spoils in the other battles. There probably weren't because we didn't go into the camps of the enemy. But this obsession with the spoils, with the counting up of it, it almost reminds you of Achan. It's so disappointing. And And what follows is even more disappointing. In Kaf Zion, Vayas oto Gidon le'ephod. And Gidon made an ephod, an object which we'll talk about in a minute. Vayatseg oto be'iro ba'ofra. And he displayed this ephod in his city of Ofra, his home city. Vayiznu kol Yisrael acharav sham. And Bnei Yisrael whored after it there. They were unfaithful to God. They worshiped the ephod, which Gidon, God's chosen Moshiach, had made. Vayehi Gidon uleveto l'mokesh. And for Gidon and his house, this was something that led them astray. Surely Gidon did not think this ephod, this object, should be worshipped. It was more of a trophy. I assume he would say it's to give thanks to God, but since when do Jews give thanks to God by shaping things out of gold? That sounds like the Egel HaZahav. And perhaps it was to brag about himself. It may be a hint that, and there are many more to come, that he liked saying, I will not be your king, but he kind of felt like the great victor and the king and behaved like one. Now, an ephod is one of the garments that the Kohen wears. David wore an ephod bad, so it's definitely something you wear. But this seems, if it's made out of gold, more some sort of a plaque or a trophy or an object. And it's almost as if the person like Moshe has turned into Aaron, collecting gold for the Egel HaZahav. Aaron didn't intend it to be an object of Avodah Zarah, and neither does Gidon. But it's a terrible mistake, a mistake that Moshe would never have made. And this makes you go back and remember the difference between Moshe's insecurity and Gidon's insecurity. When Moshe thought he couldn't handle his mission, he said to God, Mi anochi, who am I? But when Gidon thought he couldn't handle his mission, he said, Bama Oshia et Yisrael. With what will I rescue Israel since I'm so poor? It's as if Moshe's insecurity came from his belief that he had a lack of talent. But it seems to me, now that if you go back and look at that phrase, Bama Oshiet Yisrael, the way Gidon sees it, he has a lack of means. And he's a poor person who feels that having the gold is very, very important. And this undermines him here. I also think, I mean, I've just been thinking about this today, but it seems to me that it's so, that Hashem recognized this obsession with the stuff, the wherewithal. And he tried to teach Gidon that you don't need that for victory by limiting to 300 men and showing Gidon that he could invent a great strategy with the most humble things, right? Shofrot and clay jars, you know, but this is still an area of temptation for Gidon. And now, give me 1 second. Oh yes, we're gonna stop sharing for a minute. And
Angela, can I ask a question?
Of course you can.
I find this such a curious part, the whole business with the gold and the ephod, because then there are 40 quiet years, and then when he dies, it says they turn against Hashem. So it doesn't seem like they're even, it it's unclear to me what's going on during those 40 years. Like,
Well, I think that they are losing their way religiously when he's there. But he was such a successful warrior. He brings 40, those are our next psukim. He brings 40 years of peace. And he's not really mourned when he dies. He's an effective general, but he's an ineffective leader, really. But I just want to say one thing that I was going to go to before his death. If you think of the end of the fight against Midian, when Zebach and Salmun are defeated, and you can understand the victorious leader who wants to memorialize the event. So there's a way to do it. Devorah knew to be like Moshe and sing a song. That's the Jewish way to memorialize an event. Devorah's more like Moshe than Gidon in the end. Gidon had the potential, which makes it such a sad story, but he fails. And the question is, should he have accepted the kingship? That maybe he wasn't up to being a has-been. And so he had to, like the football player who retells the games and has his trophies and still wears his shirt with his number. Maybe if he had gone on to the business of leadership, for which he seems to have had a talent, that it would have been good. Maybe this was the moment we should have gotten our first king. And I think Shmuel is wondering about that.
Rachel, does it remind you of, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, go ahead.
Go ahead, we'll say what you want.
There are moments that he reminds me of David Hamelech. You know, the kid going up against Goliath, and here's this weak, young kid who's going up against Midian, and then he has 70 wives. I mean, it just reminds me of David.
You know the story very well. Just give me a chance to tell the others. So he lives like a king who won't be king. He takes the lifestyle of a royal without leadership. He marries 70 wives, and he has his ephod, and he goes back to his hometown where he's the hometown hero. And 70 wives isn't sufficient, so he goes to Shechem, which is near, but when a Jew, when they hear Shechem, should hear in their heads, dum, da, dum, 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 right? Shechem is bad news for us. He also has a woman on the side in Shechem, his Pilegesh. I don't think he turned from belief in God. But if the one who won a great victory with God's help is leading a very self-indulgent, border, dissipated lifestyle, that doesn't help the people be faithful to God. David had those temptations, but David's just on a whole different plane, right? But you have to be a certain kind of person to be victorious in war. These are men who can kill kings and can initiate that. They do have this ferocious power in them, which can be harnessed for good and can be dangerous. I see Gidon ending his life as a terribly frustrated person, as a person who needed wealth and possibly also admiration. And these aren't qualities that we want in our leaders, of course. And when he dies, what follows, to me, is the last chapter of Gidon's life and the proof of his failure. And that is that his child from the Pilegesh, and we won't try to define Pilegesh, but it was a semi-wife who didn't get the honor of being a wife. This wife of Gidon's, this Pilegesh in Shechem, has a son who is named Avimelech. My father is the king. And there's a debate whether Gidon named him that or he named himself that. If Gidon named him that, it's like saying, I acknowledge this illegitimate child. But still, he doesn't call him Avi Gidon or Avi Yerubal, Avi Melech. If Gidon gave him that name, it shows us Gidon's temptation to be king. That he said he wouldn't be king, but part of him really wants to be. But Rabbi Angel and others say that can't be, because it doesn't say Vayikra Shemo Avimelech, it's Vayasem Shemo. And Rabbi Angel says, to him that's proof positive. Avimelech named himself, and it's an expression of his frustration. I'm the son of the great Gidon, the son of the king. I should be a prince, and I'm here rotting in Shem, while his 70 other sons are praised and honored in Ophrah. And Avimelech is, I guess you would say, a sociopath, but Paul will tell us if I'm right about that. And when, now that Gidon is gone, Avimelech decides he will usurp the throne that Gidon didn't have. He will crown himself king of Israel, but he has 70 brothers. So another way that Gidon is not like Moshe, it seems that he made no arrangement for a succession. But that isn't expected of a shofet. The position of shofet is not inherited. But if he's a quasi-king, he should have worried about the succession. Avimelech goes to his connections in Shem and says, Ma tov lachem, what do you think is better for you? To be ruled by 70 people to whom you have no connection at all, or to be ruled by me, and I'm your relative, you've got an inside track. So we don't know, is he setting up a false choice that those 70 never were going to rule? Or was there some idea that this 70 would be some sort of a Sanhedrin, a committee of Gidon's sons who would rule the land? That when Gidon said, Lo aniyim shol bachem, an individual shouldn't rule over you, but that there can be a kind of secular leadership and my sons will have it as a group. It's not explained. And of course, we can't know what happened because Avimelech cajoles the people of Shem to give him money, 70 shkalim, one for every son of Gidon. And he gets some of these bums who are his followers to join him. And they go to Ophrah, and they believe they've slaughtered all 70 sons on one rock. That Jews, and the word Hamas is used, Jews have descended to Sodom. Jews are as bad or worse than anything they can complain about among the Canaanim. It's so, so low. But often in the bottom point of things, there's one little glimmer. And here the glimmer is they think they got all the sons, but the youngest son hid and survived. And that is Yotam. And Yotam is pretty magnificent. And I'm going to show you why on the screen. Let's see. Here we go. This is Mashal Yotam. Now, Shem is right near Har Grizim and Har Eval, the place of the Tochacha, the great ritual of how God punishes sin and rewards goodness. And he climbs up on Har Grizim. Of course, that way there's a valley between him and Shem can't get him. And he shouts this beautiful mashal. In the Devorah story, we had Devorah's song. Now it's another literary form. We have Mashal Yotam, Yotam's parable. And Yotam declares, Shimu Elai Balei Shem Vayishma Lechem Elokim. listen to me, God, and God, I'm taking you to court, and let God judge you. And then he says, and here's my story. The trees decided they needed a king. So first they went to the olive tree and they said, rule over us. And the olive tree said, are you expecting me to stop my important work of making olive oil? And I'm just going to go waving over the trees. La nua al haitzim. The olive tree is complete contempt for rulership. It's not important enough to waste my time with. So now they go to the te'ina, to the fig tree, and say, L'chi'at malchi aleinu. So fig tree, you rule over us. And the fig tree says, are you telling me I should stop making my sweetness and waste my time? La nua al haitzim? Forget about it. So they try a third time and they go to the grapevine and ask it to rule over it. And they say, you're telling me to start producing grapes, which brings joy to the heart of man and is used in rituals, and waste my time, la nua al haitzim? And it's not clear that all the trees supported this business of appointing a king. But after 3 refusals in Pasuk Yudalad, I underlined it, now vayomru kol haitzim. Now all the trees are getting desperate. After 3 turndowns, they have this feeling, we have to have a king. And in Yotam's parable, they now go to the thorn bush. And they tell the thorn bush, so you rule over us. And the thorn bush replies in the gray with the red, Im be'emet atem moshchim oti lamelech aleichem, bo chasu v'tzili. If you're really picking me as your king, come, relax under my shade. Ve'im ayin teisei ish min atad v'tochal et arzei halvano. And if not, right, if you're sincere, I don't trust you guys, you trees. But if you really want me as king, okay, be on my side. Back me 100%, total loyalty. Ve'im ayin, and if not, flames will come out of my thorn bush and burn up every tree right up to the cedars of Lebanon. And at the end of this, I think, magnificent mashal, Yotam curses. First, he sort of puts his case before God, and then he says, if what I'm saying is true, this is the punishment I want. Let flame go out from Avimelech and destroy his supporters, and let flame go from the supporters and destroy Avimelech. And that's exactly what happens. Avimelech rules for 3 years, and it's like a horrible upside down world of intrigues, and eventually they all turn against each other and slaughter each other. But what is the mashal of Yotam about? I think it's much more than a criticism of Avimelech. He's really not criticizing the atad, the thorn bush. Thorn bushes will be thorn bushes. Guys like Avimelech are always waiting to seize power. It's the 3 trees who didn't accept power, who were worthy, who could have done a good job, that he wants punishment for Avimelech. But really, you remember that Gidon criticized Yoash, and Yoash heard the message. Here, Yotam is criticizing Gidon. In the mashal, the message is clear. My father should have accepted the kingship, which is such an interesting idea. And it always makes me think of this story that Rav Amital told. Rav Amital alav hashalom, whose 10th yahrzeit passed the last week or so, was one of the Rashi Yeshivot of Har Etzion Gush, where my sons were students. And as a parent, I was invited to an event on the occasion of his 70th birthday. And he was a survivor. And he told the story. He said he came as a young man, I think 14 or 13, survived the Shoah, and he learned in Yeshivat Hebron, which was then in Yerushalayim. And he was a Zionist, and they were getting ready for the war, but he was learning in yeshiva. It's the only thing he knew how to do. And then close to the War of Independence, some guys from the Haganah came to the yeshiva and said, we need men for the fight. And he had been in the camps, and of course he would fight, and he volunteered to go. And he said, one of us got a shirt and one a pants, no one had a full uniform. They were a very ragtag bunch. And then one of the officers said, and you're the sergeant or whatever, you're the head of this group. He said, me, I can't do it. And the guy said, okay. And he turned to the next guy and said, you're the head. And he saw that the next guy did a much worse job than he would have done. And he made the decision, lo l'sarev pkuda. He'll never decline a mission again. And he told this as a way of explaining how he founded communities and founded the yeshiva. He said, I'm nothing special, but I learned in that moment not to decline leadership. And then he said so touchingly, and I'll tell you how I've done it. All the boys in my yeshiva who perished gave me their talents. I have the courage of Shlomi and the wiliness of this one and the optimism of that one. And of course, that combination of humility and accepting the mission, which was a hard thing for both Moshe and Gidon, is something that we need in our leaders. We want our leaders to be the men who don't want to be king. It can be because they're afraid, because they know how important and difficult it is. But on the other hand, what kind of government will we have if all the able people don't want to be involved in the dirty business of it, right? So to me, this is a terribly sad story. I think about it often when I read the newspaper, I have to say. And I just want to come back to the way we started. How is Gidon like Moshe? So he starts out, Moshe says, as I told you, says, am I worthy? Do I have the talent? And he seems to say, do I have the resources to win? Hashem is with both of them and is backing both missions. But and they both have fire at their call, right? Moshe has the burning bush, and Gidon has the fire that comes and eats the food on the rock. But there is a difference. The fire of Moshe does not consume the bush. And there are many beautiful comments that say it's a way of saying the slavery won't consume Israel. But you can also see it as the power is not going to destroy Moshe. But in the Gidon story, of course it's food, the fire can burn it up, but the fact is the fire does not only consume the food in the Gidon story, it consumes Gidon, I think. And Moshe gets a help for his insecurities, Aaron. I think Hashem tries to give Gidon a solution for his problem, as I told you before, with a very humble approach to war, but it's not too effective. Gidon does believe in Hashem, but his ego is in the way. In Moshe's first battle of Amalek, Yadav, he raises his hands to ask Hashem for help. to get Bnei Israel to look to to look up to God, Gidon tells his men to cry out, Lashem Gidon. He does put God first, but he's picturing himself as the great hero. And when Moshe is collecting gold, it's for the Mishkan, and he's fulfilling a mitzvah. But when Gidon is collecting gold, it's for the ephod on his own initiative. Sorry, this word is wrong. It says inactive. I use spell check. On his own initiative. It's a self-indulgence. But I always think at that moment, he's turned into his father. His father brought an altar to Ophrah, and he brought an ephod to Ophrah. It's so sad because he came so close. Paul's too tired to give me a psychological profile of Gidon, I guess. But it's quite a story. So if you would like to unmute and comment, I would love it. No?
I was thinking that the name of Avimelech was really Shmuel's editorial criticism of the whole institution of kingship. And this is, it just seemed ironic that his name, that he would be such a failed character, would be named, it would have that name.
Well, you know, he's on both sides. His criticism of kingship, of course, we know, and he puts it into Gidon's mouth, you might say. But but he also sees the danger of a vacuum of power, that someone will grab power like Avimelech. I don't know if Shmuel was rooting for Gidon to accept the kingship or not. I don't know if I root for him. Would he have been a corrupt king or a great king? Certainly in the story, Shmuel shows the dangers of kingship, but he also shows the dangers of not having a king. And his conclusion in his life is, have a king, but the right king. But if you think about it, there's a time when we will get kings, and we have our glorious moments, but our kings flame out pretty fast also. It's like there is no system that works. I mean, I used to think democracy works, but now it's a little scary also. Like, what does work to run the world?
A couple comments, Rachel, if you don't mind.
Sure. Of course I don't mind.
On that list you just had comparing Moshe with Gidon, I couldn't help but notice the Bama Oshia. When I keep thinking of Abraham, when Abraham says Bama Odia, how will I know when dealing with Sodom? Remember that? Bama Odia, how will I know? I don't know. I just feel like there's a comparison with that.
How will I know? I'm not sure I recognize that.
I'm looking for it right now. It's with Sodom.
You like the parallel to Abraham.
I do. But also, I wanted to say, I thought you mentioned it last week and again this week. I forgot what you call it. When you take things in the future and pull them back to the past, like the story of Abraham. I had never heard that before.
Yeah.
I think that's fascinating because really we know nothing about Abraham or Terah. It's just Lech Lecha, you know. And then I think that's so interesting as we have in our minds that he destroyed his father's idols, but really it's Gidon's story. So I thought that was so apropos.
But I was first exposed to that in one of these Herzog lectures quite a few years ago by Natty Helfgott. And what I get the principle, I believe it happened. The question is, in a particular one, how do you know? Can you date the language? And that's how I came to this issue of maybe idols weren't a primary issue then. And
That is interesting.
you know, many scholars think it is that, but I don't know how they feel so sure of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. So thank you for that. Thank you
Well,
for all of this.
well,
Indeed.
I like doing it. Have a good rest. You want to
Yes,
say
thank
something?
you.
No, we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that last week, when we first began the story of Gidon, Bnei Israel were in such dire straits. They were living in caves.
Right.
The next day, I saw in some archaeological thing that they found caves that people had lived in the north. I don't remember where anymore, but
Right.
they were probably more storehouses than places where they lived, but still, it
Right.
it
You sent
resonated.
it to me and it was amazing. And a female Israeli archaeologist explained that the stone in that area is quite soft. And people dug cisterns, caves, bunkers, and you really saw that it fit exactly. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yes, Margie.
No, I just said that's very interesting. The archaeology.
Anyone else want to say something?
I found that reference, the Bama Ada with Abraham. It's when basically God's telling him, look towards the heaven, count the stars.
Oh, right, right, right.
And he says, well, how do I know that I'll
Right.
inherit it? Bama Ada.
Yeah, yeah.
There's always a questioning.
Right,
Because he
right.
didn't have
Me, how do I
kids.
know?
Yeah,
Abraham
Yeah.
didn't have a child then, and
right.
keeps making him these promises, and he has no child. Who's going to inherit?
Right, right. He's filled with doubt.
Can I say one small thing? I mean,
You
it
can
does
say
say, though,
Two
that,
big things.
well, just little things. It does say that that for the rest of the years he lived, which was 40 years, that the land was peaceful and that they didn't worship idols. It was only when he died that all that came back. At least the Baalim.
They didn't, let's see.
It says, and the land rested
That's
40
true.
years in the days of Edom. This is 28, pasuk 28. And then it goes on that when he died, that the children of Israel once again turned to Baalim. And when you read
Yeah.
Malachim and they talk of the kings, each
Right.
one, it talks about how long it was
Right, and the
peaceful.
king himself did it, right. But
But
it,
so in a way, it seems to me that although he turned down the kingship, he obviously had some kind of a leadership going on because of what they did in his name while he was alive.
he did have some influence, but the temple that Avimelech uses as its headquarters is called Baal Brit Elohim. The Baal, the Brit, it's almost as, I'm not saying, Gidon didn't endorse this, and I'm sure his house didn't, and probably many Jews didn't, but it's as almost as if they're transferring the Brit with God to Baal, right? It doesn't seem to be syncretic, like add a little idol worship, let's say like Trafim. It seems to be more fundamental. And speaking of something else about Yiftach, Rav Meidan said, it's almost as if you want to revisit a contract and say, I'm not happy with this brit, with this deal I have with God. I never wanted to buy into it. Let's get another brit, and God won't let you off the hook, right? It's true, if you break the brit, he punishes you, but he doesn't let you out of the brit. Okay, good night.
Thank
Sleep
you, Rachel.
tight. You're all falling asleep. Rest
Oh,
well. Thank
not
you
at
for
all.
coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Keep cool.
Bye-bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.